years, I never have. This is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution. May God have mercy upon you.
Can I please have my mom before I go? Please, let me just love my mom. I love you. I love you too. And I love you too.
In the quiet corridors of a vocational campus, jealousy turned ordinary nights into an unspeakable ruin. This is the story of a girl who became a killer and a community that could never look away. Tonight, the making of Christa Pike. In January 1995, a Tennessee Job Corps campus, a place people called a second chance, became the scene of something raw and grotesque. 18-year-old Christa Pike arrived at the program with a turbulent past, a childhood scarred by abuse, early drug use, and a life that never felt safe. She was young, volatile, and already a rumor in the dorms. Colleen Slemmer was 19. Friendly, quiet, a student like any other. She had no enemies, at least not on paper. But in the fog of adolescent jealousy, rumors can grow into monsters. Christa believed Colleen was trying to take what she had, her boyfriend. Jealousy, gossip, and a small group of teenagers fused into something lethal. On the night that would change everything, the line between an argument and murder vanished. It began with a message, a promise to talk, to make peace. Colleen, trusting, stepped out of her dorm into the cold night air. She walked toward Christa and two others, Christa's 17-year-old boyfriend, Daryl Shipp, and an acquaintance, Shadala Peterson. A meeting in the dark, the kind of scene that usually ends with a hug, not with blood. Instead, witnesses say, the confrontation turned savage. Words escalated, hands pushed. One thing became another. Christa and Daryl pushed Colleen into a remote area near campus. Peterson stayed on the edge, a lookout. What followed was methodical and merciless. The autopsy would later show repeated slashing wounds, injuries made with small cutting instruments. Witness accounts and court testimony described blows to the head with a heavy chunk of asphalt, over and over, until breathing stopped. Then, in an act that would haunt investigators and the public, the prosecutors said a pentagram was carved into Colleen's chest. A symbol that transformed the crime from a jealous assault to something macabre and ritualized in the public imagination. But the horror didn't end there. According to testimony, a piece of Colleen's skull was taken and wrapped in a napkin, kept as a trophy. The three returned to campus as if nothing had happened. Or rather, as if nothing could ever be the same. Pause. Let that sit. The next morning, the body was found. The scene shattered the community. Police swarmed. Media descended. Parents who had sent their children away for second chances now confronted a nightmare. Investigators reconstructed the timeline fast. Campus surveillance and interviews narrowed suspicion to the three. Under pressure, Shadala Peterson agreed to cooperate. She testified that she had been a lookout and described how Christa and Daryl carried out the attack. Her testimony was devastating. A student who had been inside the violence, willing to tell what she'd seen. Christa's behavior during questioning and later in court unnerved people. In interviews and in the courtroom, she sometimes appeared detached, at times defiant. She admitted to luring Colleen out. Then, in chilling candor, she said she remembered the night and the acts, claiming both calculated intent and fractured impulse. The prosecution painted a picture of premeditated cruelty. The defense pointed to a different portrait, a damaged child who had never had stability, years of abuse, possible brain abnormalities, and serious mental health diagnoses. The question for jurors would be whether Christa was a monster by choice or a product of brokenness and influence. The courtroom became the theater of judgment. Each witness added detail: the lures, the blows, the pentagram, the skull fragment wrapped in a napkin. Experts testified for the defense about trauma, bipolar disorder, and possible organic brain damage. But the prosecution returned again and again to the facts of that night: the luring, the instruments, the brutality. Christa Pike was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. On March 30th, 1996, she was sentenced to death. At 18, she became the youngest woman in modern U.S. history to receive that punishment. Daryl Shipp, who was 17 at the time, received a life sentence. Shadala Peterson, who cooperated and testified, received probation. Across the country, commentators debated the case. Was this justice for a brutal murder, or a tragic example of a broken young woman pushed to the edge by circumstances no child should endure? For the family of Colleen Slemmer, complexity did not blunt grief. For the public, it sparked a cultural obsession: ritual, teenage violence, and the death penalty, all wrapped into one story. Christa's legal battle did not end with the sentence. Over decades, she and her attorneys appealed to state and federal courts, raising the same themes her defense presented at trial: mental illness, abusive upbringing, brain damage, and legal errors. Those appeals were denied time and again. Prison life brought its own stories: claims of solitary confinement, petitions for mercy, and a movement of supporters who argued that executing a woman with her history would be cruel. Tennessee faced a thorny public debate. Should the system apply the ultimate punishment to someone so young at the time, with the life she'd been given? Through it all, Colleen's family carried a different burden: a void left by a daughter who would never come home. This is where the story refuses to be tidy. We push past headlines and ask the hard questions no one wants to answer in a soundbite. How much culpability do we ascribe to an individual, and how much to a broken childhood? When does jealousy between teenagers become premeditated murder? Why did 3 young people turn an argument into ritualized violence? There are suspicious threads that never fully disappear. The pentagram carved into Colleen's chest complicated the narrative. Did that mark fuel a media frenzy that distorted motive? Was the skull fragment a grotesque trophy, or a rumor amplified by fear? Witness memories shift. The line between truth and horror blurs. And then, the legal system's own contradictions. A death sentence for a woman whose life history reads like a cautionary tale about social failure. A boyfriend spared death, but sentenced to life. A cooperating accomplice who walks free with probation. Justice in this case feels both resolved and forever incomplete. Christa Pike's name is a headline and a warning. A mirror held up to a society that sometimes fails the most vulnerable, and then, in rage, demands the harshest retribution. What began as jealousy ended as a question. When cruelty is born of trauma, where do we put our blame? On the act, on the actor, or on the world that shaped them? Tonight we followed a single violent night, but the real story is longer. It stretches back years, into homes and institutions, into choices made and ignored. Wherever you land, one truth remains: the damage of that night lasts far longer than a sentence. It lives in the quiet grief of a family, and in the uneasy silence of a community that will never forget.